Hi Cece, welcome to week 14 of your timeline. Our first card this week is Columbus Sails to the Caribbean. I won't spend too much time on this card because I think it is a topic that gets discussed in classes, in families. There are also many children's books published on the topic of Columbus, and we have a whole holiday during which we tend to learn about him and the history of that period. Mostly I just think you should know the old rhyme that many of us learned when we were children, and that is, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Those are the basics. Aside from that, I'll just give you a few fun facts and a tiny taste of the controversy surrounding Columbus. Fun fact number 1 is that Columbus was largely self-educated. He was widely read in history, geography, and sailing, but most of it was reading he did on his own with no official tutor or teacher. He was basically homeschooled. His brother, interestingly, was a cartographer and ran a map-making shop. And as Columbus and his brother worked there in the shop, old sailors would come in and tell their tales of adventure. Supposedly, according to some of his own writings, Christopher Columbus went to sea for the first time when he was 14 years old. Most of us know that Columbus was pretty obsessed with finding a trade route to the Indies. So was everyone in this era. But it's not always clear why. You might remember not too long ago we discussed the fall of Constantinople. Well, one of the consequences of the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans, the Muslims, taking over that city is that they closed the Silk Road to trade by Christians. No Christians were allowed to trade on it anymore. And it had been the primary means by which people achieved trade with the East. So now we needed to find an alternate method. Columbus was convinced that he could get to the Indies with his ships, but the governments of Portugal and Spain were not quite as convinced as he was. In particular because some of his math was wrong. He was off by about 8,000 nautical miles, but he was passionate and persistent. Eventually, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain agreed to finance his journey, and it was a journey that was to change the rest of history as we know it. In fact, they call everything in South America leading up to the arrival of Columbus the pre-Columbian era. He alone is responsible for an entire new era of our history. He went on not just 1, but 4 voyages to the Americas. He also became governor of a region in the Americas. However, he was eventually removed from that post for brutality. This topic is a controversial one. On the one hand, there is no doubt that horrible atrocities occurred toward the original inhabitants of the Americas. They were basically wiped out by diseases they didn't have any immunity to. They were also enslaved. They were treated terribly. On the other hand, many scholars think that Columbus is blamed for things he never did. The really famous example of his brutality is chopping the hand off of anyone who couldn't give him a certain amount of gold every 6 months. But there's no record that he actually ever did that. No record from either side. In fact, they think that might have been this other man altogether. The Spanish throne had promised Columbus 10% of all profits made from the Americas, basically forever. So they had a lot of good incentive to try to get him removed from his post and to try to deny him what they had promised. In fact, that's exactly what they did, and it led to about 200 years of court cases where Columbus's family tried to sue them to get back the money they were promised. In some places in America, they celebrate Columbus Day, and in some places they've changed the title of that day to Indigenous Peoples Day, or some people say it's both. The interesting fact about that is we didn't really start Columbus Day to celebrate Columbus. We started it because a major tragedy had occurred. There was basically a massacre of Italians, and the American government was trying to think of a way to reach out to its Italian citizens and say, hey, you belong here, you are valued. Let's have Columbus Day. Columbus was a part of this country's foundations, and he's important, and Italian Americans are important. That was the message. But of course, that message has largely been lost. And now in losing Columbus Day, we've also lost sort of Italian American Day. In many parts of the U.S., statues of Columbus are now being taken down, both because of more things coming to light about what the history was really like for Native Americans under his rule, and because, in general, Native Americans see him as someone who took away their way of life and changed history for them in a negative way. For others, Columbus will always be a symbol of achieving great things and striking out for adventure and changing the world. And he's not going to be forgotten anytime soon because his name appears in several regions. First, we have the South American country of Colombia, named after him. We also have the Canadian British Columbia. There's Columbus, Ohio. And even the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C., is the District of Columbia. To create the sign for this card, we're going to keep things simple. We'll just do a C for Columbus, and then we're going to do a modified version of sailing. Let's take 3 fingers for the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, and let's sail them up and down like this. So it's Columbus sails to the Caribbean. Next, we have a whole new age, the age of absolute monarchs, when kings and queens were sort of at their most magnificent and ruled the globe. Let's keep it simple. We're going to do age of absolute, give me an absolute monarchs. Just put a crown onto your head. You can make it as fancy as you want. So we've got age of absolute monarchs. We also have some dates thrown in here, and I always forget and have to go back and record them later. When Columbus sails the ocean blue, it's 1492, but it's approximately 1500 AD.
Are you almost done?
Yeah, I just need like 5 more minutes of silence, maybe. Okay. To create the sign for 15, take your high five facing you and blink it twice, just like the number of syllables in the word 15. 15, and then the good old C for 100. Don't worry about doing A and D. 1500 AD. 1500 AD. To make the sign for 18, connect your middle finger to your thumb, face it toward you, and flick it out to the viewer twice, just like the number of syllables in 18. 18. So altogether, we'd have circa 1500 to circa 1800. And that's it. The next card in our timeline is Protestant Reformation. Now, you might have noticed that word sounds a lot like reform, and that's exactly what happened. The Catholic Church broke apart, and then some of it reformed as something new, the Reformation. The word Protestant also probably reminds you of another word, protest. These are basically the original protesters. These are people who said, hey, we see some problems going on in the Catholic Church. We want changes. We protest. And it worked. And now we have an entire range of denominations that are called Protestant denominations because these people stood up for what they believed in. These denominations include Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, basically the major churches you've heard of in America that are not Catholic. Those are the Protestants. The most famous figure in the Protestant Reformation is Martin Luther. You probably see his picture on your timeline card. But he wasn't the only player. He wasn't the first person to look around him and say, hey, I see some problems with what the church is doing lately. 2 other really important figures are Jan Hus. He was a theologian in Prague who really saw some issues with the selling of indulgences, the way the church was controlling holy sacraments, and sort of getting in between common people and holiness. He was burned at the stake. And there was also John Wycliffe. He was one of the first people to attempt to translate the Bible into Middle English so that common people could get their hands on it and read it themselves. They didn't have to have it read to them in Latin or some other language they didn't speak by a special group of separate priests. Now, for some people, having the Mass in Latin is beautiful. It makes it magical and holy and special and sort of a language that now only really belongs to the church and belongs to God. Other people say that if you can't understand the words that are being read to you, they can never really touch your heart. Wycliffe got into so much trouble over these beliefs of his. He was threatened with excommunication. I think he was excommunicated. He had a stroke, so they weren't able to actually burn him at the stake. But years later, after his death, his bones were dug up and reburned along with his books, and then he was thrown into the river. That's just what they did to Protestants back then. Another major historical figure you should know about for this card is Pope Leo X. Now, Leo had a dream, and that was that he wanted to finish building St. Peter's Basilica, the huge, beautiful Catholic church in Rome. He wanted to finally finish that building that is still famous today. He needed a lot of money, so he began to sell indulgences. Now, the church had been doing this for a long time, and it's a very controversial topic. Basically, an indulgence is a letter with an official seal on it that says you've been forgiven, you're getting into heaven. It's your paper ticket to heaven. Now, the way you got an indulgence was to give your money. For some people, this was a really tangible way of expressing their faith. I'm going to sacrifice something. I'm going to give some of what I have to bless others, to grow the church, and in exchange, I receive some acknowledgement of my salvation. Others said that this was falsely convincing people that they could buy salvation with money. They also pointed out that the selling of indulgences seemed to argue that the most poor, the most needy people on earth, the ones who couldn't afford to buy their way into heaven, weren't going to get there. The Catholic Church had been selling indulgences for a long time, but this was an especially aggressive campaign. The Pope hired the friar John Tetzel to go out and sell these indulgences for him, and Tetzel was kind of a showman, and he was into fire and brimstone, and he was gonna sell these indulgences if it was the last thing he did. He famously had a little poem or rhyme he would say to people: "As soon as the coin into the box rings, a soul from purgatory to heaven springs." That's creepy, right? It's not just me. Like, that's creepy. It's creepy. Indulgences weren't the only thing that the Protestants were against. They also pointed out that in this particular culture, much of the Catholic clergy was very wealthy, while other people were poor and suffering. They also pointed out that these saints, who originally were just wonderful, celebrated former Christians, people who we remembered as part of a beautiful history and tradition, had begun to be more and more venerated. So there were statues of them all over the place, and people would talk to the statues and sort of give offerings to the statues, and some people felt that that was taking away from the worship of Christ. There was also the issue of Eucharist, and the idea that by saying only a priest could give communion, you were basically telling ordinary people, you're not allowed to be close to God yourself. You must have an intermediary. And on top of all that was the general message that some thought they saw in Catholicism in this period, which was that you're basically saved by works. Protestants believed, famously, you are saved by faith alone, by Christ's goodness alone. So back to Martin Luther. Martin Luther began to write down all of these thoughtful criticisms that he had against the church that he loved, by the way. He himself was a priest. He wrote them all down in a document called the 95 Theses. And yes, he did go and nail it to the church door. You've probably heard about that. But what some people don't know is that he tried to get it to people without nailing it to the church door first. First, he put it in a letter to an archbishop, Archbishop Albert. And the archbishop sent it on to other people and had them discuss it, and then these people brought it to the Pope, to Leo X. And he looked at it and said it wasn't worth his time. He said it was a quarrel among friars. But eventually, when he couldn't get anyone in higher authority to take him seriously, that's when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, where he was a theology professor. This nailing of the list in itself wasn't such a huge deal. The church door was basically a bulletin board at the time where all kinds of notices would be posted because, of course, everyone went to church, so everyone would see them. It was really the content of the 95 Theses that was a big deal. Suddenly, all these arguments that had been in the air for a while, they'd been in the air with Huss, they'd been in the air with Wycliffe, now they were articulated brilliantly, and everyone could read them. I mean, we had the printing press. They were getting all over the place. Now Pope Leo X noticed Martin Luther, and he said, we should excommunicate this guy. And they brought him in for trial, and they questioned him, and he would not recant what he had said. Eventually, he became an outlaw. He had to go hide in a castle. He hid in the castle of a man named Frederick the Wise, definitely wise enough to be hiding Martin Luther. And this card isn't just about Luther, so I won't get too much more into his life, but I will say that while he was there, in hiding, Martin Luther translated the Bible into everyday German. I just want to cry when I say it, so that everyday Germans could read the Bible themselves, and they could know for themselves what it was that God was saying to them. What a cool guy! And yet for many Catholics, he's seen as someone who tore down the church. A lot of people wish that changes could have just been made from the inside, so that the Catholic Church wouldn't have been split into pieces. But it did split, and we had the Reformation, so we should probably do some hand motions for it. To create the sign for Protestant Reformation, we're going to nail our 95 Theses to the door of the church. So Protestant, give us just a little hammer on the nail, Protestant. And for Reformation, give me hook fingers, connect your wrists together, and rotate them around. So we're changing it. Reformation. Altogether, that's Protestant Reformation. And that's it. Our next card is Spanish Conquistadors in the Americas. Conquistador is just the Spanish word for conqueror. So it's like conqueror, but with style. Sometimes you might also hear conquistadores, which has even more style. There's a little line you can remember if you want to have the basics of this period down, and that's Portugal and Spain, gold and fame. It's a slant rhyme, but it still works. Several factors came together to launch this period of Spanish conquering in the Americas. Some of them we've already talked about. Navigation was developing ever since Prince Henry. We had trade routes being shut down in other parts of the world, making it even more important that we find another route to the Indies. But another interesting factor in this was marriage. It was the marriage between Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile. You might have heard this name Aragon if you remember Catherine of Aragon, who was supposed to marry Arthur, the brother of Henry VIII. You might be wondering why you've heard the King and Queen of Spain being called Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile. This is because at the time, Spain, as we know it, didn't really exist. Instead, there were 5 regions or so spread across the Iberian Peninsula, and they all fought with each other and they weren't unified until these two got married. Then suddenly, the Kingdom of Aragon and the Kingdom of Castile were one. And then they started working together to conquer other parts of the Iberian Peninsula, and that led to much of what we talked about in the last timeline card, kicking out the Muslims, kicking out the Jews, worrying about the Moors, because now we're going to kind of take all that land and be huge and powerful, and it was very successful, and they thought, we must have more of this. So they began to seek for more ways to expand Spanish power, and of course, the Kingdom of Portugal was also trying to expand Portuguese power, all at the same time. This is all at the start of the 16th century. And just to tell you how incredibly successful they were at conquering foreign lands for the glory of Spain, by the end of the 16th century, 1/5 of Spain's entire budget came from the gold and silver that they got from the Americas. That's a lot of gold. Now, this period covers many conquerors who were traversing much of South America and branching into North America. It's far too much for me to cover in one little video, but I'll just give you the names of some of the key players. We have Hernan Cortez. He is the conquistador who goes after the Aztecs. We have Francisco Pizarro. He's the conquistador who goes after the Inca. Now, what I didn't know is that those two are second cousins. That's a family of go-getters, that is. Probably won the spelling bee and got the lead in the school play and conquered South America. Another famous player in this era is Juan Ponce de Leon. One really important bit of imagery to keep in mind when you're considering these conquistadors in the Americas. So you probably have the imagery of Spain. You probably have those really characteristic Spanish helmets in mind. Keep also in mind that along with these soldiers and these conquerors, nearly always we had priests. So they would come to set up villages, to try to convert the population, to handle administration in all of these conquered regions. And I just think that's some really interesting imagery. You've got conquerors wearing metal and armor, and then you've got Dominicans, Franciscans, and Jesuits, and Carmelites. But no women. There was actually a rule, at least in Spain, that women couldn't travel to the New World unless they were already married. Do with that information what you will. To create the sign for this card, we're first going to do the sign for Spanish, which you might remember from before. We take our 2 hooks of our cloak here, like our bullfighter's cloak, and we connect them in the middle. Spanish. For conquistadors, we're just going to do part of the sign for soldier. So you've got your weapon right here at your side. Conquistadors. For Americas, the most common sign is a melting pot. So link your fingers together and stir this melting pot. It's many different people of many nationalities have come together to make the Americas. Altogether, that's Spanish conquistadors in the Americas. That's it. Next, we have Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. Now, I'm guessing many of you haven't heard of this book. I don't own a copy. I hadn't really heard about it before the timeline, I'm ashamed to admit. But there is a reason for that. The CC timeline really tries to show you major events from lots of different countries and continents. And this is actually an event from France. So you might not think of it as a part of American history or British history. It's French history. We've been talking about the Protestant Reformation and the major players in that Reformation. Well, John Calvin is a major player in France. Many of the French Protestants were known as Huguenots. And at the time that Reformation ideas were spreading, Huguenots were being fiercely persecuted in France by Francis I. It's a pretty easy king's name to remember. King Francis I was executing these Huguenots. John Calvin was a law student at the University of Paris, and he was also a faithful Catholic. but he had begun to embrace Protestant ideas and to see that reform was really needed in the church. And he had been scribbling down his ideas and trying to organize them systematically. In fact, we call what he wrote systematic theology. And he realized that what he really needed to do with his book was not just share it with other academics, but send it to the king and hopefully try to save some of these Huguenots' lives. So he finished his book. It was originally 6 chapters in Latin, with a whole introductory letter dedicated to the King of France, begging him to stop persecuting people for what they believed. The Latin word institutio, from which we get this institutes of the Christian religion, basically means instructions or basics. These are the basics of the Christian religion, as far as John Calvin understood them. In his first chapter, Calvin says that his book is basically about 2 things: the Creator and his creatures, and about the relationship, the right relationship between the two. Just a quick note on why Francis I was persecuting the Huguenots to such an extent. It wasn't just that he didn't like change. This Protestant movement was fundamentally altering much of England, the country next door. Henry VIII, in fact, was dissolving all the monasteries, taking all of the statues and gold and land, and basically reclaiming it for the crown. Francis was a Catholic king. His power, his authority, was very much tied up with the authority of the church. Challenging the church was seen as a direct challenge to his authority, and all of the country's stability. People were dying and being executed in England, so you could at least somewhat see how Francis didn't want the same thing to happen in France. Calvin's book, Institutes of the Christian Religion, was an immediate success. People wanted edition after edition, and he began to expand it. The first edition had 6 chapters, the second had 17, then another edition added 4 more, and he continued to refine it and expand it throughout his lifetime. Then he translated this Latin work into beautiful French. And this translation was so moving and thoughtful that it came to heavily impact the French language for generations afterward, similar to the way the King James Bible impacted the English language for generations after it was published. I want to read you just one little passage, and it's gone through several translations and iterations, but this is the most modern translation of this passage. "We are not our own. Let not our reason nor our will, therefore, sway our plans and deeds. We are not our own. Let us therefore not set it as our goal to seek what is expedient for us according to the flesh. We are not our own. In so far as we can, let us therefore forget ourselves and all that is ours. Conversely, we are God's. Let us therefore live for him and die for him." To create the sign for this card, let's start with a C for Calvin. I know it's our second C this week. It's a very CC week. For institutes, let's take our thoughts, use that same hand to point to your dishwasher. Dishwasher break. It takes a long time to drain. For institutes, let's take our thoughts and then form something solid with them. So take that same hand that you were doing C with, get your thoughts, and bring them together. Institutes. And then let's do Christian again with the palms. Altogether, that's Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. That's it. Our next card is the Council of Trent. Basically, this is a huge meeting held by the Catholic Church in response to what's going on with the Protestants and the Reformation. And we think of this big council, this big meeting, as sort of kicking off the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation is basically the Catholic Church fighting back, countering, saying, what are we going to do about these Protestants? How will we adjust ourselves or be a part of this new world where Protestantism exists? Now, it wasn't just one meeting. That's something that I want to make really clear. The Council of Trent was the 19th ecumenical meeting of the Catholic Church, only the 19th one they'd ever had in all of their history. The meeting lasted almost 20 years, basically from December of 1545 to December of 1563. And you thought your meetings were long? This meeting, this council, lasted so long that it outlived the Pope who was in charge when it started. There were 2 popes who served during the very extended Council of Trent. During this council, there were lots of little side meetings, but basically there were 25 official gatherings where they coalesced everything that had been decided at the side meetings and made it official and made it public. There were two big purposes to this meeting, this almost 20-year-long meeting. First, they wanted to condemn Protestantism in very clear terms on which they could all agree. Second, they wanted to address all of the accusations of corruption that had been leveled against the church. Were they abusing their power? Were they worshiping idols? They wanted to talk it through and decide where they stood on all of these issues. Now, for almost every issue, basically what they did is reaffirm what they already believed. So, for example, they were accused of idolizing the saints and statues of the saints, and they reaffirmed that saints were very important, that it was okay to have statues of the saints, but they also said you shouldn't worship them. They were accused of telling people they could work their way into heaven or earn their way into heaven somehow. And they reaffirmed that in order to be justified, you had to cooperate with divine grace. So there had to be some human action on your part if you were going to be saved. But there were two really big exceptions, things that were very new that came out of the Council of Trent, and they were both very important. On the 25th, the final meeting of the council, they released a ban on indulgences. So it was now illegal to try to sell someone a ticket to heaven. The other really big development in this 25th and final meeting of the Council of Trent was their stance on Christian art. Now, the Protestants were often known as iconoclasts. They were against icons. Nowadays, if we call you an iconoclast, it means you're going against authority, you're trying something new. But originally it meant you were specifically against icons. So the Protestants would go and smash them. They'd go into Catholic churches and smash these beautiful statues of saints because they believed the statues were idolatrous. So the church really had to stop and consider, our art is being torn down, we're being accused of it being too elaborate and ungodly. What should we do? And basically their decision was, go big or go home. If the Protestants are going to be plain and humble and boring, we're going to be vibrant and emotional and so much. And that is how we will win people to Christ. So to achieve this, they set out several rules that would go on to completely impact the art world. One of them is that they wanted to avoid lasciviousness. So some of the Renaissance paintings have been quite ooh la la, and after the Council of Trent, at least anybody who was Catholic was going to really put a damper on that. They also argued that art should be pedagogical. It should teach you something. There should be a story or symbols that someone can be educated to understand. Much of the population at this time was illiterate, so this art was going to take on an important role in educating and moving the viewer, but specifically in a way that deepened their faith. They also wanted the art to be easy to follow, not too confusing for the reader, especially not confusing in a way that might lead them to sin. And they wanted the art to be venerated and honored, but not worshipped. There's a really amusing trial that has been recorded for posterity where this artist, Veronese, had painted the Last Supper of Christ. And the Catholic Church took issue with it and took him to court over it. And let me just read you something they said to him. Do you think it is appropriate that the Last Supper of our Lord includes jesters, drunks, Germans, people of short stature, and the like? So basically, Veronese was breaking the rules of the Council of Trent, and he had to change his painting. He could no longer call it the Last Supper of Christ. He had to call it Supper at the House of Levi and change some of the characters around. So basically, the Council of Trent was hugely important, and it in particular impacted the art world, which you're going to hear about in your next timeline card. It was so thorough and lasted for so long and did such a good job at what it aimed to accomplish that they didn't try another one for 300 years. A fact that many of us who have sat through meetings would celebrate. I think that this card sometimes gets skipped over. Our eyes glaze over because we don't know much about the Council of Trent. It's not really a popular cultural fixture. So I'm also afraid that the hand signs that we choose for it will sort of gloss over what it really was. It was the Catholic counter-Reformation. Now, you might remember when we did the Protestant Reformation, the sign was this: Protestant Reformation, Protestant change. Well, now we're going to talk about the Catholic change. I'm not happy with any of the sign options I'm seeing out there. I'm seeing another C That'd be our third C this week. And just the letter T, I'm seeing this thing where we put the C across us and then what we need to remember is this was the Catholics and it was the Counter-Reformation. So if you're with me, it's a bit of a stretch timing-wise, but I think we should do a gesture that sort of mirrors the Protestant gesture. So we had Protestant Reformation. Now let's do, even though we're saying Council of Trent, we should be thinking Catholic Counter-Reformation, Catholic Counter-Reformation. So let's do the Catholic sign of the cross, which is 1, 2, left, right. In Eastern Orthodox, they do right, left, but let's do left, right. So Council of, and let's do our own change, Trent. You with me? You're on my side with it? Okay, you can do it. So all together, it's Council of Trent. Our last card this week is Baroque period of the arts. I think I explained quite a bit of this at the end of the Council of Trent. So just to reiterate, this is a period when art had movement and emotionality and drama. Basically, it was more heart than mind. The Protestants were going after people's minds. They were doing the 95 Theses. They were doing the Institutes of the Christian Religion. They were writing essays and books. So the Catholics did beautiful, emotional, heartfelt art. This art featured beautiful, elaborate detail. Think of all the gold and mirrors of the Palace of Versailles, if you've ever seen pictures of it. It featured strong contrasts between light and dark. Think of Rembrandt or Caravaggio or Gentileschi. It featured intense emotion. You might have seen the Bernini sculpture, The Ecstasy of St. Teresa. In the sculpture, there are rays of golden light shooting down at her, and she's looking up into the heavens, and the sculptor has captured her in the moment when she came to know God and had a true vision of his presence. Ecstasy. That's a great word for the Baroque style. And in this style, things weren't perfect and centered. They were often twisted, anything that could give them more drama. So the axis wasn't right in the middle. It was off to the side. You'll often see in a Rembrandt painting, the most important thing happens over here or over here. And you'll notice there's a lot of movement. Clothing is always being moved. The wind is blowing these robes, or someone is giving such a huge gesture that the force of their movement is moving their clothing all around, and the painter has captured it right at the moment of movement. And lastly, of course, because the church wanted to emphasize education and telling the Christian story through art, you often find in Baroque art some kind of symbolism or story. There's a way that you're supposed to read the painting or read the sculpture or even read the building. Again, I'm not thrilled with many of the options I see for the hand gestures for Baroque period of the arts. I'm often seeing bits of decoration or detail, but that doesn't really communicate the passion or the drama or the movement or the light and shadow. So I suggest for Baroque period of the arts that you just let loose and let yourself do as many dramatic poses as you can possibly fit in with the music. So Baroque period of the arts. That's it. Ready to see it all put together? 3, 2, 1, go!
Columbus sails to the Caribbean. 1580, age of absolute monarchs.
Circa 1500 to circa 1800.
Protestant Reformation, Spanish Conquistadors in the Americas, Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, Council of Trent, Baroque period of the arts, Japan's high. Okay, here we go. Timeline, this is my timeline. Timeline, this is my timeline. Timeline, timeline. We'll start at the beginning of the ages. Age of ancient empires, creation to circa 450 AD. and the fall, the flood and the Tower of Babel, Mesopotamia and Sumer, Egyptians. 3000 BC, 3000 BC. Indus River Valley civilization, Minoans and Mycenaeans. 7 wonders of the ancient world, patriarchs of Israel. 2000 BC, 2000 BC. Hittites and Canaanites, Cush, Assyrians, Babylonians, China, Shang Dynasty, Hinduism in India, Phoenicians and the alphabet, Olmecs and Mesoamerica, Israelite exodus and desert wandering, Israelite conquest and judges, Greek dark ages, Israel's united kingdom. 1000 BC, 1000 BC, early Native Americans. Israel divides into 2 kingdoms, Homer and Hesiod. Rome founded by Romulus and Remus. Israel falls to Assyria, Assyria falls to Babylon. Lao Tzu, Confucius, Buddha. Judah falls to Babylon, temple destroyed. Babylon falls to Persia, Jews return and rebuild the temple. Roman Republic, Golden Age of Greece, Peloponnesian Wars. Persia falls to Alexander the Great. India's Mauryan Empire, Mayans of Mesoamerica, Punic Wars, Rome conquers Greece. Roman dictator Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus and the Pax Romana, John the Baptist, Jesus the Messiah. Year 1 AD, year 1 AD, year 1 AD. Pentecost and the early church, persecution spreads the gospel. Herod's temple destroyed by Titus. Diocletian divides the Roman Empire. Constantine legalizes Christianity. India's Gupta dynasty. Council of Nicaea, Augustine of Hippo. Jerome completes the Vulgate. Visigoths at Rome. The Middle Ages, circa 450 to circa 1500. Council of Chalcedon, Western Roman Empire falls to barbarians.
500 AD, 500 AD.
Once is enough. Ah!
Byzantine Emperor Justinian.
Benedict and monasticism. Mohammed founds Islam.
Clans in early Ghana in Africa. Franks defeat Muslims at the Battle of Tours.
Golden Age of Islam. Ooh.
Vikings raid and trade. Japan's Imperial.
Charlemagne crowned Emperor of Europe. Alfred the Great of England.
Eric the Red and Leif Erikson.
Norse explorers. Vladimir the First of Kiev.
Byzantine Emperor Basil
II. 1000 AD, 1000 AD. East-West schism of the church, Norman conquest and feudalism in Europe, the Crusades in Zimbabwe and early Mali in Africa, Aztecs of Mesoamerica, Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas, Japan shoguns, Incas of South America. Genghis Khan rules the Mongols. England's Magna Carta, Ottoman Empire, Marco Polo's journey to China, the 100 Years' War, and Black Death, the Renaissance, China's Ming Dynasty. Age of exploration, circa 1400 to circa 1600. Prince Henry founds School of Navigation, slave trade in Africa. Gutenberg's printing press, Songhai in Africa. Tsar Ivan the Great of Russia, the Spanish Inquisition. Columbus sails to the Caribbean. 1580, age of absolute monarchs.
Circa 1500 to circa 1800.
Protestant Reformation, Spanish Conquistadors in the Americas. Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, Council of Trent. Baroque period of the arts, Japan's isolation. Jamestown and Plymouth colony founded. Age of Enlightenment, circa 1650 to circa 1800. Hudson's Bay Company, first great awakening. Classical period of the arts, the 7 Years' War. Age of industry, circa 1760 to circa 1969. James Cook sails to Australia and Antarctica. American Revolution and General George Washington. Madison's Constitution and the Bill of Rights. French Revolution, Second Great Awakening. Louisiana Purchase and Lewis and Clark Expedition. Napoleon crowned Emperor of France. Liberation of South America. The War of 1812, the Missouri Compromise. Immigrants flock to America. The Monroe Doctrine, romantic period of the arts. Cherokee Trail of Tears, U.S. westward expansion.
Marx publishes the Communist Manifesto.
The Compromise of 1850 and the Dred Scott Decision. U.S. restores trade with Japan. British Queen Victoria's rule over India. Darwin publishes
The Origin of Species.
Lincoln's War between the states, reconstruction of the southern states, dominion of Canada. Otto von Bismarck unifies Germany. Wars in Africa, the Spanish-American War. The Progressive Era, Australia becomes a commonwealth. Mexican Revolution, World War I and President Wilson. Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. U.S. evangelist Billy Graham.
USSR and the Katyn massacre.
The United Nations formed, the Cold War, Gandhi and India's independence, Jewish state established, Mao and communist victory in China, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Korean War,
Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement,
Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, missionaries to Ecuador, the Antarctic Treaty, the Vietnam War, U.S. astronauts walk on the moon.
on the LNP. Yeah.
Age of information and globalization, circa 1970 to the present. Watergate, President Nixon resigns.
The best is au revoir.
Fall of communism in Eastern Europe. European Union formed. Apartheid abolished in South Africa. 2000 AD, 2000 AD, September 11th, 2001.
Our fellow citizens are waiting.
Rising tide of freedom, rising tide